Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. Father, we thank you again for this wonderful day that you've given to us, and that is the day that you have made. We thank you again that as our priestly role, we get to inquire about the scientific activity of the wonders and the awesomeness of your creation. We thank you that Tom, gather together men that really take your creation seriously and also take Jesus seriously, and by whom for all things are made. And we thank you that we can discuss this material. And we just pray your Holy Spirit will be here with us so we can recognize how much you love us and what an awesome God you are. And we thank you that you made this creation for us, even like we talk about the anthropic principle. So we thank you. We just pray you open up our mind to understand these things, and these discussions will be beneficial to us and to all those that hear and watch in the future. So we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Good. Well, today we continue on with volume 11 of 12 volumes. We only have 2 left in this collection of people who T.F. Torrance knew well enough to gather them together and to ask questions about what was possible, what was happening in the world of theology and science at the frontiers of knowledge. This one, this is a fairly challenging book. One of the reviews I read said, I think that the scientists will like how complex this is. I'm not sure how the theologians will do.
Yeah, maybe so.
So anyway, I think there are chapters and concepts that are accessible, but to say it has a lot of scientific lingo about the nature of the universe that is not common language. So the whole question about, why did T.F. Torrance want E.J. Ambrose to do this? And I think part of it is that he was, a significant professor of cell biology, one of the ones who laid some of the foundations for understanding DNA. In other words, he's a major figure in the world of scientific thought. And he was a Christian who served in the life of the church. And I think Torrance felt like what he brought. I'm trying to get a sense of T.F. Torrance's whole overarching ordering of these books. This one here, as we're approaching the end, is this looking at the biggest picture. T.F. Torrance was very emphatic about the unity of knowledge of the whole universe. And this book certainly is attempting to take on the whole of the unity of the macro universe down to the micro universe and bring it all under what Torrance would called The Ordering of Creation. That is, in a sense, where the title, The Mirror of Creation, is to say that the nature of creation in its orderliness has a dependency upon, a contingency upon an orderer, namely God, that is part of this fine tuning of creation that has become, a dominant motif. Now, this book was written in 1990. 1990 is when I went to New Zealand to do my doctorate, and I was thinking, wow, they were writing these books right when I was, doing my doctoral research. It's just funny to think about in time how these things came to be, and that T.F. Torrance was somewhere doing this. I was in New Zealand with Alan Torrance, and on my birthday in 1990, James Torrance was there too. So I had my birthday dinner with Alan and James Torrance there in Dunedin, New Zealand, which is a pretty special time. So this book on the question of what is called the anthropic principle, which, Ted, you talk about the anthropic principle sometimes, right? I was thinking, who is it that talks about that? I think I've heard you talk about the anthropic principle. Is that true?
No, actually, it was our friend in New Zealand mentioned that last
Right.
2 times we talked about the science stuff. I can't think of his name offhand now for something. Bryden, yeah.
Bryden, yeah.
Yeah. So this whole idea that in the end of this book, he says, we once talked about the Earth as the center of the universe, and then we came to recognize that the Earth wasn't even the center of our solar system, that the sun was that, and the Earth went around it. But at some level, he says, one must consider at some level the nature of what it takes for the Earth to exist as it does. And that we might say that physically the nature of the Earth is not the center of the universe or even the solar system, but the uniqueness of it, the capacity of our Earth to sustain life, the particular life that we have, one could say theologically, there is a sense that we could say it appears that the universe has been framed, formed, designed in such a way that it allowed for the coming into being of this earth as it is, with all of the dynamics of life coming into being, the nature of the seasons, all those things are, in a sense, theologically pointing to something of a centeredness. So, what do you think of that? Does it make sense?
Well, as he points out, it's remarkable that there is life.
That is remarkable.
The life that we see, including humanity, is truly a miraculous thing. Along a similar line of thinking. So the book was published in 1990, probably written for a few years prior to that. I don't know how long it took him to write it, but and I wonder, in terms of what he talks about in terms of cosmology and the like, there's been a lot of changes in the scientific community about that. As you know, there's a lot of controversy about things like the singularity and et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that would change his conclusions necessarily, but do we have anything from Torrance subsequent to that time where he engages with that at all? That's more current, or was that kind of the last thing that he
subsequent to 1990?
Yeah. Sorry to get you off track here. I just was
No.
Was wondering.
So,
we have all the work that Biologos has done, for example, and they're engaging with both theistic evolution and intelligent design, which they kind of reject. I don't know if this author would have considered himself one to embrace intelligent design, or if he would have called himself more of a theistic evolutionist or precisely an evolutionary creationist or whatever. Not to get all hung up on labels, but there's been so much controversy about it. I'm just kind of curious as to where Torrance placed himself, if he did at all. But
so in 92, of course, the book Mediation of Christ, subtitled Evangelical Theology and Scientific Culture. So he's still thinking about scientific culture, the nature of what goes on from there.
Sure,
there was a festschrift in honor of John Templeton, which TF wrote an essay, Christian Theology and Scientific Culture, The Way Ahead. So I'm not sure what that exactly might have done.
Yeah, I was just curious as to whether or not either he or the author of this particular book had engaged kind of in some of those. I mean, there was quite a dust up after 1990. Not that was a watershed year by any means, but there was quite a bit of controversy. I think in part it was because the scientific community, at least cosmologists, were beginning to poo-poo the idea of a singularity. And
right. Well, we need Kerry Magruder on that, don't we?
I suppose he would be the guy. Yeah. Well, I don't want to get us off track. I was just curious as to
I think it's a relevant question. 1998 was Divine and Contingent Order, so that is something certainly that is going to engage the kind of claims that Torrance is going to make on the singularity of the universe. Science and Access to God, Epistemological Perspectives, that was 1998. I think that's an article in a journal.
Yeah.
Of course, he dealt with in 98 Einstein. Yeah, the question about the theories of unity or diversity in the universe, to say when there's a theory of multi-universes and things like that, is that part of what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean the problem with the idea of a singularity is when you get to a singularity, there's really nothing there. It's just a mathematical concept. But I think I don't want to start criticizing scientists as to what's going on, but I think they sort of didn't like the idea because it suggests that something started all this. So a multiverse kicks the can down, like way down the road,
Way down the road, yeah. Turtles upon turtles.
And obviously Torrance and this author have no problems at all at understanding God's direct involvement. So I guess they would have considered themselves as evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists or whatever. I don't, not to get all hung up on labels, but I would be curious as to what they felt about some of the ideas of um, some of the design ideas that we're trying to preserve some of the creationism concepts. I suspect they would not have gone along with that.
Yeah,
But they seem
creationism is probably not the language. I mean, the nature of what has been over the last few decades published by people who go under the name of creationism, which tend to be young Earth theories and things like
clearly
that.
would have rejected that. There's the intelligent design movement, which is sort of a subset of the creationist
Sure.
movement. With
Yeah. Well, Todd can tell us about that probably.
Behe and Dembski, those guys. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's wonderful. This is I'd like to get, I want to get the whole book and read it, but I suspect if he were rewriting it today, he probably would have to deal with some of the more recent thoughts among
Yeah.
the cosmologists in particular. I'm just curious as to whether or not he did
Right.
or what
Well, I
Torrance
think
did.
question about the people who push back against um, the design, intelligent design people is
Yeah.
starting with the creation because it falls into the problem of natural theology, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, for example, Biologos has kind of rejected that idea that it really is a way to kind of hang on to certain concepts of that God has done it all and didn't really use evolution as a tool, or if he did, it was just a minor thing that happened.
Right.
For me personally, and I guess this would be Torrance's perspective, it is truly remarkable that God, who created the universe out of nothing, invested it with a freedom to develop in a way to take it to the end that he had in mind. And whether or not then God intervened at certain points in time, or he just started it and it was all there and it all happened on its own, so to speak. Those are fascinating questions for which I don't know that science has answers or theology has answers. We do see what we see, and we're learning more and more about it all the time. And it is truly remarkable, just truly remarkable.
Well, I think if we say theology and natural science both have explanatory powers and limits.
Correct.
Right. And so to say, in some ways, if you take the intelligent design folks and just do what it is that Torrance is saying, start with the nature of the God who creates and say, within that creation, we can see God's design, this divine and contingent order. We can see that there is orderliness, and just proceed with, in a sense, the confirmation of what it is that we're seeing that theologically says this is remarkable and seems improbable that it could have come into existence without the guidance of divine intervention or divine creation. And that the real problem is just a question, as it is for both Torrance and Bart everywhere, is where you begin makes all the difference in the world. And so if you take what looks just interesting to you and build a system on it, then it's going to be a problematic structure. But if we say the nature of the God who creates the universe creates order, which implies that God designed, in fact, the nature of our planet with a moon to do what it does with seasons and all those things, then you wouldn't go to that dynamic of the planetary interactions to prove God, but to say that the nature of them, in a sense, is a confirmation of what it is that the Bible begins by saying the universe that God creates is orderly. And sun and moon are part of the
mobile device.
That was Bill.
Was that Bill?
Yeah, from the silence of his
Okay.
photograph.
Okay. So yeah, the question about the ongoing quote unquote insights of science, and where does the authority come from to throw out certain proposals that there in a sense can't be anything other than a theoretical possibility, and has it at that point become a philosophical point rather than a scientific point, really engaging reality as it is? I think that this book, if nothing else, it really does want to ask questions about, what have we discovered about the universe as it is?
And that's remarkable discoveries and up to 1990 and even beyond now. So it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, there is lots in this book that in 1990, I mean, just the age of the universe being somewhere about, I think he has it about 15 billion years old. That's, I mean, now the things I looked up said 13.7, but you know, that's a few billion years between
Yeah,
10.
give or take. Yeah, give or take. Yeah, one of the things I found so fascinating was his point, and I don't know that I'd run into this before, his point that the Earth has not been here long enough for some of these things to have developed, that life would have had to come from outside the Earth somehow. And I'd heard the idea that life came from outside, but I didn't know that that was of a necessity, you know.
Yeah.
That was a fascinating thought. But
Yeah, so that's the whole world of the sequencing of the development of the Earth and the possibility of life on the Earth, which
right.
the later chapters in the book are going to go more into that. And we'll look at some of the summaries. I think the summaries are pretty accessible, so that could be helpful. So Todd writes, repeated theoretical attacks of classic Big Bang theory on absolute beginning of the universe have been theory driven. So the attacks have been theory driven. Sounds like new evidence has repeatedly and to date without exception collaborated a beginning out of a 0 point for time, space, matter, and energy. In other words, the position that he's defending in this book still stands.
Yeah, so Todd is saying the singularity hasn't been tossed out. It's just I think there's just a lot of scientists who sort of embrace scientism as a philosophy that just don't like that idea. It doesn't work for them.
Yeah, specifically, yeah, I think that's a great point, Ted. What I meant by theory driven, sort of ideologically driven,
right?
Not evidence driven, because, and I think you put your finger on it, because they hate the idea of a real beginning, because a real beginning has all sorts of implications which undermine metaphysical materialism and have all sorts of theistic implications.
Yeah, it sure does.
but it's just amazing. All of the new, all of the findings over the decades of the 20th century have just again and again and again re-corroborated classic Big Bang theory, a beginning out of absolute nothing. And even the Webb telescope stuff in the last few months, and what Dr. Ambrose was talking about in this article, some of the fine tuning stuff has also similarly been re-corroborated, where it's even more astounding how much of a razor's edge of a razor's edge of a razor's edge
how narrow that is. Yeah.
The boundary constraints are much tighter now, it is believed, than when this gentleman was writing, and there are new and there are whole new categories of tight boundary restraints that hadn't even been considered when the book The Anthropic Principle came out at about this time that this article was written.
Yeah. Man, that makes you feel kind of vulnerable, man, right on that razor's edge. It's a good thing.
Yeah,
good thing God upholds the creation as well as brought it about. So.
Yeah, or on the other hand, cared for.
Yeah, there's that, right?
Yep. That's going to be his point in the end of the book, of course. So, just to read my introductory statement here, this 11th book in the series explores the ordering of the universe, the fine-tuning of creation, the anthropic principle, reflecting on the created intention. So the intentionality of God is going to be significant at all, that we exist and thrive in this place as confirmed by modern science. So throughout the book, science for him is a confirming function, which I think partly the mirror of creation is to say science has a task of mirroring back, Torrance calls it finding voice for creation, to acknowledge its creator.
Yeah.
So the fine-tuning universe and all that is all part of that. So as I say in my nutshell, this book is scientifically complex. Todd, I'd be curious if it was for you. It was for me, but you may be more highly trained in the sciences than I am. I want to argue that every level of science reveals the uniqueness of the universe in creating space for human existence. Creation mirrors back that there is a creator without revealing the creator himself. In other words, not natural theology. But we see his hand at work at every level of the strata of existence. And so Torrance's concepts of strata, and Polanyi's again deals a lot with the strata always being explained by that which is higher. You can't explain the higher by the more simple, but the higher is what it is. The simple, to start with a mere amoeba doesn't explain why we ended up with humans with all the complexities we have. But to say that the nature of, a God who creates a universe with the interrelated systems that function and create the space for humans, that is doing the theological confirmation that science can provide to us. So again, Ambrose died in 1996, so this was 1990, and I think some of these were taken maybe from previous writings and brought together in this book, though some of it may have been for this. Born in 1914, so I mean, from 1914 to 1996, the world of science had a lot going on, and he was clearly in the middle of it, which is why Torrance respected his participation in this series. So he examined modern experimental science and fields of thought to see the creative activities of God. He served the church and also in writing to show that scientific knowledge is not in conflict with Christian faith. That's a statement that he makes, that his agenda as a scientist and a theologian is to say there is not conflict here. Looking at Torrance's, the end of the foreword, of course, TF always writes the same in all of them, and then goes over to his own kind of dialogue about the professor or the writer he's looking at. So on Roman numeral 8 in the general foreword, the author, Edmund Jack Ambrose, sounds like a good British name, emeritus professor of cell biology, University of London, widely renowned for his research in the structure of proteins, the structure of normal and cancer cells, the microbiology of leprosy, which is kind of interesting that he dealt with leprosy. Although his early studies at Cambridge were the physical sciences, he soon moved to biological sciences. So he spanned those disciplines within science. During the war, he joined the Admiralty for research in infrared detectors, subsequently undertook research in the structure of proteins using infrared radiation. This is where it goes beyond me. I don't know about these things. At the Courtauld Fundamental Research Library, and his research on cancer at the Chester Beatty Institute. In the field of molecular biology, he discovered the way in which weak forces maintain the shape and biological function of proteins that has proved to be the key to the structures of other biological macromolecules, including DNA. So I won't go beyond that at that point, but just to say, this is somebody who was really involved heavily in the world of science. The nature of what his contributions were have had a lasting impact down to this day.
Yeah.
So he did write quite a number of other books. The first one that's mentioned was 1965. In 1982, he published The Nature and Origin of the Biological World. And then Torrance on Roman numeral 10 ends just talking about his involvement as a church, served in the church as reader in the Chichester diocese. I probably said that wrong, but anyway. So he has been so bold as to prepare this book with religious faith, but confirms, to show that modern scientific knowledge is not in conflict with religious faith, but rather confirms that faith. With St. Anselm, he says that he does not seek to understand in order to believe, but he believes in order to understand. So the nature of science, as Torrance is proposing, and he is living out here, is that one has to believe that there is a world, that there is order, and then one then asks, what's going on here? And so that investigative heuristic investigation is, in a sense, the nature of what this book is wanting to pursue. So he does write a short preface, which there are just a couple of phrases that I wanted to pull out of there. One is that the nature of science as it was going forward in some ways is merely a fragmentation of knowledge. So it's interesting to to think that the way that science has become so specialized, that science in some ways has made it impossible for any scientist to get the big picture, to maintain the big picture of what it is that science is doing. And so if everybody's a specialist and nobody can see the big picture, then you have a fragmentation where people can't, in a sense, be tying together the nature of what all is going on. So my father-in-law started the University of Washington's family medicine program in Spokane, Washington. It was the second family medicine program in the US that he started. He said to me one day, I train generalists, doctors to be generalists, because they have to go into every small town in all of Eastern Washington, Oregon, Idaho. They need to be generalists to be able to see the big picture and how to see what's going on and get people to help. At the University of Washington, everybody's a specialist. Everybody has their very narrow field that they work in, and we need them to be specialists, but they can't. I couldn't put them in a small town. They wouldn't be able to deal with what the needs are of the people in the general kinds of knowledge that are necessary for people to function with health in small town contexts. And so, in a sense, what it is that he's saying here, that what science has done in its specialization in many ways has lost what it is that the Bible provides, and that is an origin from which the universe exists, an explanatory dimension that there is a meaning and purpose within which it exists. And if we go along with that, things will go well. And when we try to take over and control the nature of the world to serve our own purposes, then we end up with problems. We become masters, we become Lord, and so the nature of the breakdown of what it means to be stewards, caretakers of creation, of humanity, all of those things begin to be problematic. So it also it seems like in people's minds, science is such a monolithic institution. It's a single thing, as though when science says, there is this sense that everybody kind of agrees with, or at least is in the same boat, where the nature of what he's doing here is saying that is not the case. Science has specialized in such ways in so many cases that we've lost the ability to hold things together. And so his other point that he wants to make is that theology does bring in the unity of divine creation. And it allows us to think about the magnitude and the complexity of what it is that we're discovering, and to say, as Ted keeps using the word remarkable, it's remarkable beyond what we can even begin to imagine. The complexity of what's there, and particularly the fine-tunedness of what has ended up in the world in which we live, and the world to which God addresses himself in the person of Jesus. And when he says, I came to give you life, to say, well, it goes to much even deeper levels than just showing up in person. I am actually the one that made it all, so there could be life. In the introduction, he again puts out there just the nature of everything he's going to be doing is going to be to argue for a fine-tuned universe. And as Todd so eloquently points out to us, just the razor sharpness of distinction. If it was just this much different, we couldn't have what we have. And so fine-tuned means that there seems to be an attentive eye to develop the nature of the universe, not just our world with all of its amazing stuff, but the universe itself as the context within which science is now discovering the whole universe had to be ordered in a particular way, so that we end up with the world and the capabilities of this particular world. And as we know, even within this world, there are levels of ordering. We look at the universe, and we've got the new Webb telescope to see the ends of the universe and see the order of what's there with lights and black holes and all those things. But as he says towards the end of the book, we're sitting kind of in the middle between all of the distance of the universe going to its extreme and the universe to how small it gets. We live kind of in the plateau, the strata of reality it's somewhere between the huge extents and the complexity, the micro complexity of what it is in the world that is super small. Do you have any thoughts on that? The nature of where we live in the middle of the extremes of the universe?
Well, I mentioned before, being on that razor's edge makes you feel kind of vulnerable. And
Yes.
I'm gonna have
Yeah,
a
it
nightmare
just-
tonight, man. But you think in terms of also sitting at this confluence of two universes, in a sense, sort of this expansive macro universe and this expansive micro universe. And you go like, wow, my little slice of reality is just a very small piece of what's really going on. And it's like, how amazing is that, huh?
It is amazing. What were you going to say?
Yeah, a quarter century ago, astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez provided the data for, I'm forgetting maybe you folks know the name of the University of Washington professor who wrote Rare Earth. I'm forgetting his name right now, but a lot of it was on Guillermo Gonzalez data, and Dr. Gonzalez wrote some articles about what he called the quote galactic habitable zone, which we happen to be in. Where, as you look at conceptions of the Milky Way galaxy, you see these spiral arms. Well, we're between spiral arms, and so we are not bombarded by flaming brimstone all the time. And so we need to be exactly where we are between the spiral arms. And another thing that Dr. Gonzalez pointed out is we're not too near the center of the galaxy, where we would have too many heavy metals. If we were just a few ticks closer in, we would have too many heavy metals for life to be possible. And if we were out just a little bit, we wouldn't have the right elements that we happen to have. And then he goes on and on, even in our solar system, we're the right distance from the sun. If we were where Mars is, we wouldn't have liquid water. And or if we were a little bit in, we wouldn't have closer in, we wouldn't have liquid water, or further out. And anyway, it goes on and on and on. We're in a circular orbit. You need a circular orbit, of course, to have, which isn't, as we look at exoplanets, looking for planets that might have life on them, we see that their orbits are too elliptical, generally speaking, to have liquid water consistently and to have life. Anyway, it just goes on and on and on. If you look at the list of things that are needed by an exoplanet, and how after every one that we find so far, unless there's been one found in the last few days that's interesting, as a new exoplanet, as every exoplanet has been looked at in detail, it's like, darn it, that's another one that just doesn't, and they've looked at thousands of these things, of these exoplanets that are candidates theoretically for life, but so far nothing has been so habitable as Earth. And hence the name of, I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman's name who wrote it, but the book Rare Earth, it's like it's the more you look with a critical mind, it doesn't, there's not a good reason to think that life is just teeming out there in the universe, as has generally been thought, that, well, it's just so big, it's got to have life out there. Well, the more people look, the more they're thinking, this setup that we have. And then, if I may just add another interesting point that Guillermo Gonzalez said, is if you come up with a list of, say, the top 25 things that make life on Earth habitable, it's kind of fishy, Gonzalez says, that it's the exact same list that makes scientific discoveries that we have made, that human beings have made possible. The easiest one that anybody can see is just clear atmosphere. As we look at planets, clear atmosphere is not a common thing, but we've got this clear atmosphere that allows for life the sun and photosynthesis, et cetera, et cetera. And it also lets us make scientific discoveries, such as astronomical discoveries. And he has a whole list of things we probably don't want me to go into right now, but there are about 10 things that perfect solar eclipses. There are about there are a number of scientific discoveries that have only been possible because of perfect solar eclipses. And as far as we know, maybe nowhere else in the universe is there a perfect solar eclipse like we experience on Earth. And kind of related to that goes along with the habitability. Of course, it's the just right, the Goldilocks positioning, if you will, of the moon and its trajectory and its velocity that allow for life on Earth. For instance, if we were off on our axis by 1.5 degrees, there would be no human life on Earth. And it's the moon that keeps us in our 22 approximately degree axis, to the sun. And you can just go on and on about things that the moon, where the moon makes life possible on Earth. And again, we don't see anything like the moon, like our moon, as it relates to our Earth, anywhere yet that we've been able to see.
Sun, moon, and stars in their courses above. Join with all
Yeah, but
nature.
let me just emphasize that part. And Guillermo Gonzalez and philosopher Jay Richards came out with a book in about 2004 called The Privileged Planet. And the Privileged Planet hypothesis says that it talks about how habitable, the things that make for habitability also make scientific discovery for intelligent observers possible. And I just wanted to say that you folks can comment on this because you know Torrance better than I, but I think it's interesting how Torrance says that things have been created by the mind of God, who has created us in his image to have a mind which so corresponds to his that we are set up for scientific discovery. And it's kind of like the privilege. I think it coheres with Gonzalez and Richards' privileged planet hypothesis.
Absolutely. Rare Earth, it says it's by Peter D. Ward and Donald Brownlee.
Yes. And the one of the main astronomers they were relying on, like if you look at the footnotes on the book, is Guillermo Gonzalez. He's just kind of a publishing wonder, and had a lot of stuff out on that galactic habitable zone at the time, and a lot of the things that make Earth also particularly habitable. Yeah.
Sounds like you do a lot of reading in this area.
I've had an interest historically anyway. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like your interest is still there, which is all good. No, I appreciate your comments and the things that you bring in. It is such a vast thing that to be able to engage all the things that you're talking about, reading and all that, what they're discovering and all is all quite phenomenal. So chapter 1, well, there's 3 parts to the book. So we'll just briefly note our ordered universe is going to be chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so in that, he is literally looking at size of the universe, the coming into being of the universe, and all the ways that in some ways they have been able to figure out why it has come to be the nature of what it is. Part 2, it's chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And so there he's going to go into the biological dimension of the earth. How did life come to be? So the title, The Symphony of Life, is to see that there is a resonance within all that is made, the ability to create what he calls the cradle of life, within which there can be this first spark of life that comes, and then all of the pieces that go together for the development of life, and how amazing those are. And the 8th chapter, he goes on to the origin of the species and talks somewhat about the nature of humans within that, the history of humanity at some level. And then the final section a farewell to materialism. So to say that materialism, at some level, he is going to deem as a kind of it's a philosophical religious position. There is only matter. There's nothing other than matter. Anything that we want to make is just reading something into what's there. So it's an entirely secular position that reduces the nature of reality to matter. And so in chapters 9 and 10, this is where he really does most of his theological work in this book. So the whole nature of creativity, the design, the second section within chapter 9 is the grand design. And then the continuous working out of the design is part 3 in there. And creation seen as a glorious activity. Again, glory is to say the nature of the universe as it is created. It owes its beauty and wonder to God, and glory is the nature of the seeing of what it is that God has done. And then the final chapter, the spiritual dimension, it deals with some of those questions about the size of the universe, but really calling back to the nature of the Christian awareness of what it is that God as the creator has brought and what it means for us to be made in the image of God. He does acknowledge in part 6 of that just the problem of sin and our rebellion against God and the problems in the world. He says, for goodness sake, I worked with leprosy and cancer. You think I don't know the world's not perfect? And then he's going to end up with some comments about what it means to be a scientist who will argue that, again, the nature of science as a scientist confirms to the best of his ability to say, and doesn't really allow him to say otherwise than that there is a creator who has brought all of this into being. So that's just a quick overview of where it is that he's going and the big scope of the book. Now, this first chapter is the one chapter that people did have to read if you chose to read it. Did any of you read chapter 1?
Yeah.
And did you understand all of these, the time sequencings of the beginning and from 10 to the negative 45th to 10 to the negative 46 seconds? And I couldn't quite get my head around all that.
Yeah.
But I can tell that he can.
Sometimes time moves very quickly.
Well, there's a lot happening with the universe exploding into being, and this whole sense, I guess, to say the universe is continually moving out. He says towards the end of the book, we tend to think of things just moving through the universe, but the universe itself is moving. It's expanding and moving out. So to get our head around that dimension is beyond, in some ways, what it is that we're even able to do. And his illustration of balloons and the nature of point A, point B dimensions, and then there are dimensions beyond it that we have no model to be able to enable us to see what is actually happening because it's so complex. It's like, okay.
Put simply, I think one of the things he's getting across is that the fine tuning goes all the way back as far as we can see, and
Okay.
has just continued, and was very active at 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Just
Right.
so it's not like any explosion, so to speak, that we could ever imagine. Because it is so amazingly tuned in everything. The just set up just right so that carbon can be made, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Good. So it's like if you're shooting at the moon, if you're just 1% of a degree off, you'll miss it.
Yeah.
It's kind of just the need for precision that is there. So I'm turning over to page 23, which is the summary. And again, we did post the summaries as they appeared in the book. And thanks to Ted for getting those all turned the right way so they're easy to read. So point 1 of the summary, studies of the heavens by astronomers together with studies by physicists of the ultimate particles have demonstrated that the universe arose from a minute speck of unbelievably high energy, which I'm always the word unbelievable. It's all unbelievable in a sense, but we're believing it. We're believing that happened. Anyway, it's the irony of we need to believe the unbelievable.
Well, and maybe it's even more accurate to say not that it arose from a minute speck, it arose from nothing.
Yeah.
So
Right.
is the singularity one step beyond nothing, or is the singularity nothing,
Yeah. That's a good point. And the question of the creator piece that's there, John McMurray in the final chapter of Persons in a Relation says, we have a choice to make. Either you believe that the universe is meaningless and that everything is merely chance and we're lucky to exist at all, or you believe that there has been an ordering that is caused by a personal being, so that all that has come is ordered and brought it to the point of what this book is arguing, that we as persons can exist here. And so in a little bit of it's his apologetic stance of, before you go on to say anything, you have a decision to make. Is this all chaos and we really can't make sense of it? Or do we need to acknowledge that there is this beginning point beyond that speck point that you said, that it's not just that it's nothing, there's something even before the nothing, and that is the one who brings it all into being.
Yeah, and that's that raises some amazing theological issues of why is this God who needs nothing creating something out of nothing, and why would he do that? It takes you in a whole other direction that he doesn't get into. Again, I've not seen the whole book, so maybe he gets into that more at the end of it. But yeah.
Well, Karl Barth has the sense that the nature of God is one who is loving and creative, and so
exactly,
creation is not an element of needing God; it's an expression of the being of God, the one who loves in freedom, creates in freedom.
Precisely, yeah.
All of that is the working out of it. And volume 3,
and
the
gives being to something that is not him.
Yeah, and covenants with it, establishes a relationship of sustaining and accompanying all that he's made as again the working of the loving, freeing character of God. That yes also gives us the freedom to go along with God, and we won't call it the freedom to reject God, but the possibility of rejecting, even though God will not reject us, even in our saying no to him. So all of that to say, the nature of Torrance's view of scientific theology is to say that there are things that science can say about the material world and its age and things like that, but it can't speak to that what happened in that before the speck, before the nothing came into being. And that is where theology steps in and says, all of this only makes sense in the light of that revelation. It's not us coming up with the theory, it's simply acknowledging the nature of the theory that is there. And to say that is a significant kind of thing. It's a starting point. It allows us to explain instead of saying we just don't know. The second point, the spec expanded in a precise sequence. So the sequencing, Todd, that's what you're talking about, to generate the various subatomic particles, which this whole thing of generating subatomic particles, again, it's hard to get. It's one thing to see stars. It's the generation of subatomic particles is quite amazing. And the glue particles, which maintain the forces between them. During the expansion, the temperature fell progressively, which that's cooling, right? So that which was incredibly hot became cool enough to become solid. Radiation and matter were constantly being transformed one into the other. And again, radiation, I'm not a specialist in radiation. Matter, I get. Radiation that's heat and energy. Is that
another form of energy? Yep.
Another form of energy. So again, Einstein equals mc squared. Energy equals mc squared, the tying together of the relativity of the universe as created by God that Einstein came to discover. And Todd, as you're pointing out, I think that it was eclipses that Einstein used finally to prove his theory of relativity. So he came to Washington State once to try to get it, but it was a cloudy day, and so we had to go, I think, to Australia or something.
Yeah, Eddington was the one who sent squads of astronomers to Africa and South America in 1919, and the error bars were pretty big, but what they found was gravitational lensing, where they would see they were able to see stars on the other side of the sun whose and the reason they could see them is because their light rays were bent by the amazing gravity of the sun, and
Right.
and the way they were able to see them was in the relative amazing blackout of a perfect solar eclipse.
Very good.
The amount that the light was bent was the amount that Einstein had predicted. And Einstein, you're correct. Einstein had mentioned solar eclipses should be used to corroborate my theory, but it had not been corroborated. There was no empirical there was no evidential corroboration yet of relativity theory before Eddington, who was said to be one of three people who understood relativity theory, before Eddington sent his teams of astronomers to look at stars blocked geometrically in a geometric line by the sun, but were able to be seen because of light bent by gravity.
Right. So we shouldn't feel bad if we don't immediately understand it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. If you're so dumb, Marty, that you don't understand relativity theory, I mean, you apparently haven't had intermediate algebra like I have. So yeah.
I think that was the class. No, that was math, and I got a B in. But anyway,
it may be a way of saying we don't have the imagination that Einstein had.
Well, imagination, yeah. I mean, he used the word in this book of intuition, which is Torrance's word. But
yeah, exactly. And Ambrose mentions that. Yeah,
or the ability to see something.
He had the intuition to see something that had not yet been observed.
Yeah. So that's quite amazing. Which, in light of the conversation about Torrance a few weeks ago, that Torrance where McGowan couldn't understand how Torrance could use imagination or intuition as being in any way scientific. Right. I think this book is bringing it, and your point that you just made, it requires a level of intuition to see what has not yet been seen and then to be able to confirm it. So, yeah. So the universe became cool enough for the particles to associate together and form the nuclei of atoms. And again, I kept going, how did they figure this out?
Isn't it amazing that God gave the creation ability to be creative?
Yeah, there is an organizing that's going on. Next, the electrons associated with the nuclei to form atoms of hydrogen and helium. Radiation and matter became separated from each other, and there was light. Again, just the sequencing of these things coming together, the nature of light as it comes into being, which obviously becomes really important for life on our planet as well. Then vast gas clouds of hydrogen molecules, which again, I want to see the movie on how these things all appear here. Were drawn together by the force of gravity. Stars and vast assemblies of stars called galaxies were generated. That hydrogen provided the nuclear field, which enables stars to shine almost unchanged for millions of years, which that's mind-boggling too, that, these stars sit out there for millions of years burning, and you just think of, I mean, we're just so used to burning in an oxygen-rich environment where something's gone. Your fire burns up at the end of the night. If you put it out, if it's not gone, but stars literally burn with the intensity that they do to be able to see, across the universe. It's all just like, wow, how does that even happen? So anyway, in giant stars, when old, the hydrogen fuel was exhausted, helium and heavier elements were burned up. In this process, the vast range of 92 chemical elements was formed. How do you know anything about the 92 elements? I'd never heard the 92 elements that he's referring to here.
I'm sorry, I didn't finish the article, and I will say no comment.
No comment, yeah. And this is
that's a fascinating part of the chapter describing how the elements appear on Earth.
Yes.
Where they came from, how they developed. Yeah, because that's huge. Well, Todd, you were mentioning that those exoplanets they have too many or not enough, whatever.
So the
Yeah.
ability of all of these materials to show up here that were necessary to create what it is that allows our environment to function. It's kind of like if you've seen the movie Babette's Feast and her ordering all the things that are brought to make the feast. It's kind of like he's got an order in several, billion years ahead to make sure all the right ingredients are up to make the feast that is the creation of the earth, metaphorically speaking.
If I could say one little fun little faith builder for anybody, a kid or an adult, is to read like an elementary book on the elements and just how each element, be it gold or lead or whatever, how each one has been ended up being used by humans, and it's just amazing how each one does something very useful for humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like somebody intended it to. We didn't just stumble across it. It's not something we could just happen to use. It's things that were essential for our being and for the environment within which we live. Point 9 in the summary: enormous gravitational pressure and generations of vast numbers of almost massless particles, neutrinos, caused these stars to explode. Only in this way could the 92 elements be released instead of being trapped in dead stars. These elements are essential for the generation of plants and life. So again, things happening out in the universe that ultimately are essential for what it is that came to be the life-giving environment we live in. Point 10, the clouds of dust and gas came together to form new stars. After successive generations of these explosions, the mixing of products were different explosions. A dust and gas cloud was eventually formed, which generated our sun and planetary system. Again, he's moving past millions of years with the brushes of a few words here to be able to bring together, to visualize, these explosions. And oh yeah, there's our sun and planetary system now in point 10. Quite amazing. This led to our Earth being generated, this is point 11, with a unique combination of chemical elements, mass, and distance from the sun, which alone makes the existence of life possible. And that's the point Todd's been making about the particularity, the razor edge that allowed the coming into being of our particular world. So,
Yes.
So that's a summary of chapter 1. So, I mean, he's really giving a history of the universe. Who was it that wrote the book, The History of the Universe? Or History of Everything or something?
A Brief History of Time by Hawking.
Hawking, yeah. So how would Hawking's accounting pair with what it is that he did here?
Well, Hawking, what is considered, generally in physics and astrophysics to be his most important, or one of his most important contributions, is a series of articles that he wrote with Roger Penrose and George Ellis in the late 60s on basically on the singularity, and to put it in Todd, meaning it's really beyond my ken, all the math and everything, but basically what they said was, as you go back in time, it's kind of like matter and space is kind of like a spiral that gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and as you go back far enough, there's actually an infinite tightness, and they rather carefully, and pretty much nobody argues with them. It's pretty well accepted, and it's called. They were credited with, quote, solving the field theories of relativity theory, and
Right.
and anyways, you go back in time, the tightness of space is wound so tight that there's actually an infinite curvature to the universe, which corresponds to zero space. And then reasoning from that, well, how much matter can there be? Like, how many atoms can there be in absolutely zero space? Well, zero. And if there's zero matter and zero space, how much energy can there be? and so basically their inference is that there was an absolute 0 point for time, space, matter, and energy. And so it basically corroborates Big Bang theory. There aren't so here we have, not only does relativity theory corroborate Big Bang theory, and that relativity theory implies an expansion of the universe that is coheres with what we see in the redshift of galaxies, et cetera, right. But it also corroborates Big Bang theory, a creation out of nothing, a creatio ex nihilo, because through Hawking and Penrose and Ellis' work, it points to a 0 point, an absolute 0 point.
Right. So it sounds like there is a high correlation between what it is that has been done there and what this book is confirming.
Yeah.
Beginning point, developing, and all that. Right. Good. Well, thank you for that. So chapter 2, we won't go into super detail on that, though we'll look at the summary in the end. But the fine-tuning of the universe is the title, and so it gives examples of fine-tuning within the nature of all that came into being. And then in his point 2 part on page 33, the underlying principles of fine-tuning, which the A that I have there is kind of similar to what you said, I think, Todd, a few minutes ago. I think, therefore, the world must be the way that it is. In other words, if the world wasn't the way that it is, I wouldn't be able to think. Right? So even the fact that we're able to think about the world has been made in a way such that we can think about it.
Well, we certainly wouldn't be here to think.
What's that?
I said we wouldn't be here to think if it wasn't.
That's definitely true. So then, he throws out a week. Oh, go ahead, Todd.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I misspoke about the field. The way it's spoken of is that Hawking being kind of the main guy, solved the field equations of general relativity theory in the late 60s. So he kind of filled out a missing piece of relativity theory that in coming up with the universe came out of an absolute 0 point.
Right. Which, I mean, like everything else we're saying, it neither confirms nor denies exactly God, but it does say we have a reality that we must do the best we can to explain why it would be that case, and just to recognize it is the nature of reality, and there are some explanations that are better than others. Like,
and we're not quite there and bringing it all together yet, but maybe someday some physicist will.
Well, the question of what is it for a human to bring it all together? I mean, there comes a point where I believe in order that I understand doesn't mean I get to understand everything. But at least we recognize that we are observers in something that is way bigger than ourselves. And the nature of it is such that we can say that there is something about it that one cannot merely say is all chance or chaos or something like that. That's not an acceptable proposal. So we eliminate some of those things that in many ways are kind of held as dominant proposals, and we say there is something about the nature of the universe in its orderliness that we must at least consider the possibility of God. And in believing that possibility, it makes sense of all kinds of things. And if you choose not to believe it, there are people who talk about just religion generally and Christianity specifically making it all up. And it's like, so if you can't explain the meaning of all of this and you just make up that there is none, what makes your making up that there's no meaning any better than those who say there's meaning because God revealed in the person of Jesus? If that makes any sense. They're both proposals. One of them seems to have grounding. The other is kind of a self-defeating argument that if life is meaningless, if it's all meaningless, then even your observations about it are meaningless because you have no point from which to argue meaning. or meaninglessness.
Nihilism is self-defeating. That's right.
That is true. So at the
Actually,
end,
Marty, I just
yes,
that's where last time we were talking about science, that's where the missing component of the teleos, the purpose, the goal
right,
to
right.
the end, the means to an end, and even as the creation decays, because obviously that creation that was created before the fall or sin or entropy and decay entered in. See, we're dealing with a scientific investigation post perfection.
Yep.
And so that alone, like that alone tells us, so even beyond the creation that was made, that Adam and Eve, when it was perfect, had intersection with the other dimensions, heaven and earth, because we have no access to that heavenly realm. We're told right at the beginning in the first statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. And so the fact that we are blinded and closed off to that extra dimensional stuff and have no access to it, because one of the components about a lot of the confusion people have is dealing with all this extra dimensionality, where it's like the Bible tells us there, this is the shadow, that is the reality. And when they're
Yeah.
doing mathematical computations, they can't understand where the diffusion of gravity as a strong force goes. It's because it's interconnected in these other dimensions that we don't have access to, which is sort of the shadow. And they sort of use the language of the holodeck or the matrix type of thing to address how we interact, because we transcendence is bigger than the creation,
Yep.
and that.
Yeah. Okay. We have lost Ted. Goodbye, Ted. Reading just a bit of the end of the fine-tuning chapter there in chapter 2, in contrast to the 18th and 19th century ideas that the universe could have reached its present state by chance, there is now clear evidence from astronomy that precise control or fine-tuning has been essential to bring about a universe in which stars, galaxies, planetary systems, and life can exist. So again, that's a major shift in the nature of science. The magnitude of the mass energy in the initiating spec and subsequent vast rate of expansion had to be controlled at an almost unbelievable level of precision. That was your point, Todd. It's the nature, even from the beginning, that precision had to be there to end up where it is today. So the masses of various building units, the magnitude of the forces between them, the properties of light, also had to have precise interrelationships that we find today. So again, he's just working out the complexity that's all present there. Point 4, the very existence of hydrogen as a necessary nuclear fuel of the stars was also dependent on this fine tuning. So the elements themselves and the nature of what they provided in the process. And then point 5, the generation of carbon and oxygen, key elements of life, in the proportions required, was dependent upon the precise tuning or resonance of their planetary electrons. Without the repeated explosions of old giant stars, these and other elements needed to generate life would never have been released into the universe. So again, there's this time release of life-giving elements that are part of the process of the fine-tuning. And finally, for point 7, these and numerous other examples of fine-tuning and coordination of activities during the generation of the cosmos have left astronomers to speak of the anthropic principle. This states that the universe had to be exactly the way it has been from the beginning in order that we can exist. It is therefore logical to believe in an underlying basic design directed toward the generation of our planet. That's the telos you're talking about there, of life and our human race. So again, that is going to be this further expansion of just the process of fine tuning. So the size of the universe, the development of it, the fine tuning of the universe was chapter 2. Chapter 3, he goes on and talks about order and disorder. James Clerk Maxwell shows up in there, and the nature of what it was that he was able to follow from that. And just there are 4 points at the end of the chapter in summary. The existence of order in a system can be explained in terms of the analogy of driving a car in a country district where a map gives guidance at each road junction so that the destination is finally reached. Disorder corresponds to driving without a map, taking branches at random. Point 2, at the level of atoms and molecules, any system which restrains the molecules, like the map mentioned above, and limits the possible motion of the particles is said to be an ordered system. So you're directed, telos, to the endpoint that you're aiming for. Point 3, a correspondence therefore exists between the level of restraints imposed by the map and the level of order. The message of the map is, in modern technology, called the level of information as used in computers. High information is equivalent to high order, low information, disorder. And finally, this concept can be applied both to the cosmos and to the biological world. This kind of order is not a vague concept, it can be measured precisely. And I think DNA and all that is part of that, the constraint that ultimately ends up with what it is that we have. So that chapter was on order and disorder and the necessity of the directedness of it to arrive at where we got. So then we go on to the second major section, the Symphony of Life, chapters 4 through 8. So the Symphony of Life, again, is just going to deal with the whole nature of chapter 4, the earth is the cradle of life. So talking about how the atmosphere came into being, the building of the earth, the structure of the one Pangea that broke up into different parts, and ultimately the arrival or the outworking of carbon atoms, the first living organisms. He talked about how those would have come into being, and the nature of sunlight to provide energy for all that was going on in this environment. And he has a brief summary on page 69 on that chapter. So a study of meteorites formed the same cosmic dust as our solar system that revealed the 92 chemical elements in their particular proportions were generated from 2 different giant star explosions of second or third generation stars. This particular form of dust generated the solar system, with our Earth of a particular mass, size, and distance from the sun, which gave it unique features favorable to life. The atmosphere derived by gassing out of the rocks also produced enormous quantities of liquid water. So the Earth's movements and eruptions produced vast mountain ranges. The rocks were weathered by heat and rain to release in the rivers and oceans the chemical elements needed for life. This is a big recipe that's putting together the elements of life. The atmosphere, mostly of carbon monoxide, water vapor, and nitrogen, was generated. The water contained salts of sodium, potassium, phosphate, calcium, chlorine, magnesium, zinc, etc. The earth had been prepared as a suitable cradle for life. So again, he's giving this picture of the bringing together of it all. And I won't read the whole list of it, but he just keeps on talking about the elements and the progression to create the cradle of life that exists for us here today. Chapter 5, then he moves on to the nature and origin of life, which there's a quote at the top of it by Alexander Pope. Order is heaven's first law. Order is heaven's first law. So divine and contingent order is T.F. Torrance's, in a sense, way of saying that basic thing, I think. So this chapter, 30-some pages, just talking about the development of living cells, the nature of what needed to happen for replication, and out of that, the working together of cells to create something that he uses the metaphor of a factory, developing a plant that reproduces, and ultimately we end up with DNA. And just talking about the complexity of all that has to imply that there's something designed here, with the final question asked, could life arise in space? Which he basically says no. All of the elements that are required with heat and energy and space, there isn't that ability to arrive, for life to arrive in space. It requires the environment that we have here on the Earth. And so then on page 99, he has a summary again to wrap up that. The astonishing complexity of the so-called simple organisms has been revealed by modern molecular and cell biology. The cells of microorganisms can be less than 1/20th of a millimeter in diameter, but their activities within this minute volume can only be understood by comparison with sophisticated chemical factory under the control of a major computer program. So anyway, he's just talking about the structure and the complexity. The best we can do to compare it to it is something that's a complex factory with complex computers running it. That's the only appropriate kind of metaphor for the complexity of what's going on. So he goes on to, in his summary, to talk about the nature of the playing out of how that factory works and what it produces, and ends with the point: the vast input of new information required to establish the restraints that maintain the order in the simplest possible organisms can be explained if we accept that the origin of life is the work of a creator. By accepting this reality, the various possible stepping stones from non-living to living, studied by biochemists in the laboratory, can be accepted as stages in this creative process. So again, he's arguing for the nature of only with the nature of a creator can all these things have come into being. Chapter 6 then goes on to the meaning of order in the living world, with a typo on that. I recognize I had a typo in the chapter title. Oh well. We'll fix it when we write up my final article for Participatio.
You're just checking to see if anybody read it.
Yes.
Good test. Embed
All
the
things
test.
are. Yeah, well, if that's the test I fail, I'm okay with that. All things are artificial, for the nature of for nature is the art of God. So the word artificial means something is made, and so to say the world is the art of God is to say that it is artificial. It is the work of God. So it's an interesting play of words that he has there, and that a quote from Thomas Brown at the beginning of chapter 6. So in chapter 6, it's a relative, well, it's not as long of a chapter, but the meaning of order in the living world. So he's going to talk about the nature of complexity in organisms and how with plants and water and food, all of these things came together, and a final section on the nature of animals with the ability to have eyes and nerve cells. So it's the components of living beings that he's kind of talking about in chapter 6, with a summary on page 115. The level of order or complexity in any given organism can, in terms of modern physics, be defined precisely in terms of the magnitude of the information contest, i.e., the amount of map reading required to produce the necessary molecular restraints and interactions between the various parts. Nevertheless, organisms are so complicated and diverse that they have at present to be described in more general terms. And he goes on to talk about the levels of those terms that are used there, and the nature of going back into the complexity of the animal kingdom, the geology records, and just seeing, again, the complexity of all these things in the particularities of organisms that are there. And his final point 7, the earliest microorganisms in algae were stagehands able, using chlorophyll, to generate oxygen, so forming a protective blanket of ozone in the upper atmosphere. This shielded the Earth from ultraviolet radiation so that the animal kingdom was able to come into being. Again, just the nature of the chess game of each, in a sense, playing a part is part of the amazingness of what's going on. He then has this pretty long chart on levels of complexity in the plant kingdom that goes on from page 118 through page 130. So we're not going to attempt to play all that, see all that's going on there, but he does have all of the level of the complexity done in this chart form in the development of life on Earth. Chapter 7, the living symphony, how embryos grow, is where it begins. So he just talks about the nature of going from the particularities of the nucleus into the whole development of living cells working together and creating then adult organisms. The quote at the beginning of the chapter: "Move in melodious time and let the bass of heaven's deep organ blow." That's from John Milton, hymn on the morning of Christ's nativity. So this whole sense of the breath of life at some level breathed into the nature of being sounds a little bit like echoes of creation, with Adam getting the breath of life. There is a summary on page 153. The enormous complexity achieved in the higher organisms revealed in tables 2 and 3, which is that's the long set. Yet each organism develops as an embryo from a single cell, the fertilized egg, with little apparent internal complexity. This remains the great wonder and mystery of biology. It has been called the living symphony by biologists. To generate this complexity, there must have existed the necessary information as potential within the fertilized egg cell. The individual genes carry messages in DNA chains for making various molecules needed by the cell. But individual players working in isolation in the orchestra would produce a cacophony if they weren't working together. So once again, even within that. And so he goes on to talk about the nature of the harmony and the development of a living being with all of these pieces in the putting the puzzle together to get what it is that we have in the end. And his last point in that, I'm skipping a whole bunch of his points. Studies in the living symphony provide massive evidence for an underlying design in the biological world. Which again, I think the nature of what he's doing here is just he's building that sense of, where we have the possibility of giving explanations, and the best explanation seems to be an organizer, designer, creator.
Actually, Marty,
Yes.
that motif is actually as far as symphony goes and how the interaction goes to understand the lower levels. That's a really good metaphor for us looking upward and how the church relates to the interaction of the invisible, because we interact with the invisible through faith, just like we interact with trying to understand the physical. But yet, when you're in sync and you're in order, there's a result that happens that couldn't happen any other way without the initiation.
Right.
So the church really needs to think through, because I like Tom's metaphor of the symphony, because you can see where different components in the church, where we have these components, and there's the chair in that group, but yet they're all ordered together, strings versus the horns, and you've got your percussion. It's too bad we couldn't take more serious how to how to order ourselves and play the song properly. Twinkle,
Well,
twinkle, little star.
That's the invitation, isn't it? To have our lives reordered, metanoia, to align with the symphony of God, which I use the symphony of God in my Church Dogmatics Volume 2. The music and the symphony of God are a major metaphor that I unpack in that book. So chapter 80 is going to move on to the origin of the species. So now you're dealing specific with humans, and he discusses Darwinism, that Darwin wouldn't have had a problem with the nature of God. And so in a sense, that there's been a false direction that's been developed there with that. He talks about changes within species and the ability of change to come about, and the necessity of the directionality, the telos, as you said there, Dwayne, to come to what it is that we end up having. And he talks about levels of changes, small changes, larger changes, and the changes that come for living beings in the end to actually have the existence that they do have. It's a fairly long chapter. He does have a summary again for us on page 181. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 have revealed the gigantic levels of order with associated information content that exist in the living world. Two factors help to maintain this order in individual organisms. Just as a river maintains its identity by the continuous flow of water between its banks, so an organism can only maintain its vital functions by a continuous flow of matter and energy through its walls. The organism superimposes its order on this ever-changing matter. Cut off from the flow, it reverts to chaos. According to the laws of physics, all systems tend, if left alone, to revert to maximum disorder. As described by Ho, Saunders, and Fox, the basic nature of the universe, the chemistry of its elements, particularly carbon, is favorable for the maintenance of biological structures. This accords with the anthropic principle in which we recognize the design of the creator. So he goes on and makes a whole bunch of other points about the nature of genes and the way they develop, and the nature of the creation of the elements of the species that come into being out of that. Reading just the last couple of his points in his summary here in this chapter. We're not denying the important role of natural selection, which may play an important role in generating new but similar species of comparable complexity able to survive in different environments. But to postulate that increased levels of order and information could arise by randomizing processes is illogical. Leading biologists recognize the origin of species is in the melting pot at the present time. Whatever new hypotheses may eventually arise to take into account the new discoveries mentioned above and others, the overriding consideration is that freedom, flexibility for change must exist among species in order that life can survive in a changing world. But this flexibility is like the malleability of the clay in the hands of the potter. Utilizing this softness of the clay, the master potter has step by step built up the glorious panorama of life in its diverse and complex forms in a manner wondrous to behold. So that's his conclusion on chapter 8, which is the conclusion of the whole development, leaving only his two final chapters, which are kind of his theological chapters in a sense. So part 3, farewell to materialism, is basically to say the argument that it's all by chance, that there is only matter in the world, none of that in the end makes sense. It has to be something that was in an era of naivety, that couldn't see the complexity and the progression that are necessary to get the world that we end up with here today. So he has a little blurb in the beginning of this third part, in the end, saying these various findings have been achieved by the scientific method, but their implications are far beyond from the banal suggestions of earlier materialists. We have come to identify an underlying mystery which lies beyond the entire reality of the physical world. Clearly, different people with different backgrounds will interpret this mystery in different ways, but to deny the reality of the mystery would clearly be to bury one's head in the sands. In this last part of the book, we will look further at this underlying mystery. So the last part of the book, A Farewell to Materialism, is an invitation to mystery in the sense of the best of science, the Einsteinian sense of pursuing to discover, Polanyian's process of discovery, indwelling more and more reality to understand what's going on. So in chapter 9 on creativity, he's going to argue that there is creative intelligence that backs up the world, that the nature of the design that is there is a grand design that oversees the whole of what goes on, that they're not just little parts here and there that are developing, but there's a working together in the design of all things, and that this is the continuous outworking of the design by the designer that has been going, as Todd pointed out. It needed to begin at the very beginning, and it's been working out ever since then to achieve what it is that we have today. So that at the end, to say the creation is a glorious activity is based to say the only logical understanding of the universe and our earth and our life here within it is to see it as the glory of God working out to create what God has in fact created, and we are the fruit of that. There is no summary at the end of chapter 9. So are there any thoughts? We have one more chapter to end here. So anything on the nature of creativity?
I like that word flexibility that he puts into dealing with all these counterforces in the creation, because that's the contingent. That's what drives people crazy, because God's creation is so amazing that it can handle flux, and its natural self-correcting, life-giving design. It always goes to create order. Like we do not realize how thankful we should be that he made the world that way, that it's consistent everywhere you go, whether you're in Seattle or Grand Prairie or another in Italy or whatever like that. That's the amazing thing. We take that for granted.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the nature of creativity, when we're talking about the Holy Spirit from the beginning and through, to say, even today we have creativity because the Spirit does a work to give us eyes to see that we are made wondrously and that we've been given the freedom to create wondrously as well. So even human creativity in some way has that flexibility you talk about to be creative, right? And so, we have somebody like you and somebody like me, and we're different, and yet we're each given the ability to become expressions of the creativity of God in the world. So it's all rather amazing. So the final chapter, chapter 10, the spiritual dimension. So he has a quote at the top: God is present in nature, but nature is not God. There is a nature in God, but this is not God himself. So that's the Bartian distinction of there is a created world. Don't confuse the world with God, because God's the one that made it. So they are separate, and yet God is the one who has made the nature as we know it, which has been the argument of this book, basically. So he does argue, he begins a section called Other Dimensions. To understand how God transcends or goes beyond the present universe, we may have to accept that God is outside time, as was believed by St. Augustine, and we can throw in Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Torrance, maybe a few others. It is possible to show that such a belief is not inconsistent with modern ideas about the universe. An old analogy may be of some help. In a one-dimensional universe, can be represented as a narrow groove in a flat surface. An Ennead, a garden worm, moves along this groove. All it can do is to move forward and backward along the groove from A to B, from B to A. A planarian, a flatworm, now comes along on the surface. This is a two-dimensional surface like a table. The planarian can move anywhere on the surface unknown to the worm except when it reaches the groove. It can suddenly appear before the worm on its track and then disappear. Equally, it can do so behind the worm. To the worm, it is incomprehensible. Now, a bird enters the scenario. The bird in the air can move in 3 dimensions. This bird lands on the surface and is seen by the planarian. It walks about on the surface and is still seen. It flies off and becomes invisible to the planarian. To the planarian, this behavior is just as mysterious as the movement of the planarian is to the worm. In addition, the bird can watch and follow all the movements of the worm and the planarian, unknown to them. To define the behavior of all 3, the worm, the planarian, the bird, we have to introduce a 4th dimension of time. We need, for example, to know the time when the worm is halfway through A to B, the time when it reaches B. The bird lives in what Einstein has called space-time, 3 dimensions of length and 1 of time. And he's going to go on to talk about the nature of God as being another dimension that creates this dimensionality, that they're each one of 1 layer, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional. Each one of them can't recognize the nature of the others, and yet the nature of the higher one, the bird, for example, can see both of the others. And so the nature of God is going to be that which sees from above. On page 209, he has an interesting quote from Julian of Norwich. Julian said in 1373, so this was a long time ago, there was a dream or a showing that she said that God brought. And she said, he showed me a little thing the size of a hazelnut in the palm of my hand, and it was round as a ball. I looked at it with my mind's eye, and I thought, what can it be? The answer came, it is all that is made. I marveled that it could last, for I thought it must crumble to nothing. It is so small. And the answer came into my mind. It lasts and shall ever be because God loves it. And all things have being through the love of God. In this little thing, I saw 3 truths. The first is that God made it. The second, that God loves it. The third, that God looks after it. So he's building this picture here from Julian's vision that the nature of how we stand with relation to the universe has this sense of the relation that she's seeing with this hazelnut. That God makes it, God loves it, and God looks after it. That is the nature of the universe as well. He's expanding the nut, in a sense, to the whole nature of the entire universe. Did you have a thought there, Todd?
I had a thought. It reminds me of okay, this is slightly tangential, but it reminds me of the it seems in every Eastern Orthodox church I've been in, there's some picture, sometimes up in a dome up above, but there's some picture of Christ, sometimes of a very small child Christ.
Yes.
Like holding a cue ball in his hand, and then related to the hazelnut, and that cue ball, I'm told, is supposed to represent the entire universe.
Right.
And it's it's getting across that this man, Jesus, even when he was a zygote, even when he was a embryo, even when he was a fetus, even when he was a 3-year-old, was holding the
Right.
all things together and was the
Huh.
creator of all things.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so I mean it's just the whole understanding of theologically that we understand that Christ can do that, and the universe compared to him is like a ball, a cue ball, or a nut in his hand, and he made it, loves it, and sustains it.
And that's, that's just a slide aside. That's just one of the great one of the great insights that the redemption of the world is totally tied to the creation sustenance of the world. And when we see that Jesus is the carer of all things, the carrier of all things, the creator of all things, the sustainer and holder together of all things, then we begin to be able to believe more than a lot of the church believes. Unfortunately, we can believe when we see Jesus as not only the Savior, but the Savior, creator, holder, sustainer. Then we can see that when he's always embraced us, and when and that we were found in Christ before we were lost in Adam, and that when he died, we died. When he rose, we rose. When he ascended, we ascended. And we didn't have to vote on that for that to be true. And yeah. So anyway,
Yeah,
this whole creator, Jesus as the creator of holding the acorn of the universe, is just very important, I think.
yeah,
Soteriologically,
right.
nothing new, of course, to Bart or Torrance lovers. But I mean, I think it's just such an important distinction that the church needs.
Yeah. And the world has a hard time understanding that, right? I mean, you can understand when you say to somebody, the universe here in Jesus' hand, it's just like a hazelnut. It's like, what? Are you crazy? Have you gone nuts? But to really recognize the nature and the grandeur of the God who creates the universe, and that the Jesus is the one by whom and through whom all things are made, you have to understand it in light of that and say it goes beyond our experienced reality to say that. And that's why it has to be a revealed reality that this is bigger than our heads, our little pea brain, nutty heads can get their head around. But it is the case, and it brings the meaningfulness of the universe and everything this book is talking about into focus.
Yes. Yes, it's also important, of course, for us to see that his whole life as Jesus of Nazareth was salvific for us, that when he learned to overcome temptation, I was with him and I was learning to overcome temptation. When he was baptized, I was baptized.
Yeah.
When he learned obedience, I learned obedience. When he grew up, I grew up.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, in this chapter, he's going to focus on Christ as the one that getting reality into focus is to understand the nature of reality, the universe, in the focus of the Christ, who is the one that brings it into focus. And that the world, we can say sin at some level is the world out of focus, where it falls from grace, runs from God. That is the world out of focus. And for many people, they think that's what the world is, but they're looking at it through unfocused eyes. And so they can't see the nature of the reality that this book is attempting to bring into focus. And so on the next to the last page, he states, because God's love is limitless, his love is centered on each one of us. Love requires an object. Love has a need to give, to make a sacrifice for the one who is loved. We have been endowed with the power to accept this wondrous love of God and return this love, be willing to give ourselves. The true nature of the divine love is revealed in Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus did not ostracize leprosy patients, he tended and healed them. Mahatma Gandhi looked upon Jesus as the supreme artist, the artist of truth. But it is the cross of Christ which finally makes sense of the universe. God suffered on the cross with and for us to save us from the evil that is within and without. The cross does not explain the origin of evil. It does not give us the cause of suffering, but it gives us the assurance that the love of God extends to the acceptance of this terrible suffering of the cross for our sakes. The cross overcomes by love the greatest problem of all, physical death. A living organism has already been likened to a river. In our own bodies, there is a continuous flow of both energy and matter. Some parts turn over within a few days, our bones more slowly. But every atom in our bodies has been replaced by new atoms every 7 years. Our physical bodies do not have permanence. It is the idea of a human being which has permanence. We impose the pattern, the designs of that which is us on the matter that flows through us. Our life through the world is pilgrimage. What we call physical death is the transformation of one pattern, one idea to another. As St. Paul says, it is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a material body, it is raised a spiritual body, which this chapter is called the spiritual dimension. And so it's seeing the life beyond. General de Gaulle had a Mongol daughter, and while president of France, he visited her every day. She died young, and he said, she is now like the others. And so that was, the incapacity of this world given to the renewal that comes beyond the grave. So the cross provides the final victory over sin, over evil by suffering. The cross is followed by the resurrection of Christ, the foretaste and the assurance of the conquest of death. This is the final meaning of the spiritual dimension. Even with all the meaningfulness of the created world, there's a more meaningful dimension beyond, I think is what he's saying. Final paragraph.
Actually, Marty, can we actually need to go beyond that? I think my favorite scripture there is in the Revelation. Behold, I make all things new. No more tears, no more sorrow, no more crying, because I will be your God and you will be my people. Like that's the teleos. Like I think that's going to shock everybody. That all because we talk about the suffering Messiah and the way he took on our humanity. When all that pain and suffering were, because the last while I've been meditating on the fact that Jesus didn't have to die because death is only a byproduct of sin. But if you know no sin, death has no place in you. And so that's how he can speak boldly. Like I lay my life down, I take it back up again. There was nothing in the divine order or the divine council, either realm, where this man could be given the verdict of guilty. And that's where death came from. That's what we forget. We weren't there when that divine judgment came and the council said, you've broken the law. We can't let you take from the tree of life. And then we've lost our memory at the whole point and purpose of being the priest of creation, and we've lost our identity. But that's what holds it all together, that behold, I make all things new. And we're already new creations right now and taste, so unless people have that access, because even you notice at the beginning of that comment, it's not wrong, but it's not complete. He talks about there needs to be an object where we got to make that delineation. There's both object and subject, but the subject is more important because it's personal. And then that's what changes our life, because that knowledge is made personal. It's not some abstraction from one object to another, a possibility. No, it's real. It's more real than the real, because we're subjects, and when God speaks, it's real. It's permanent.
Yeah, and it's all that getting back to the reality that, we think we see reality looking out the window, but there is a deeper reality, as you're saying, and we can't see it outside of Christ, who shows us that reality, both in its initiation as well as its completion, in and through the work of Christ. So the final paragraph, in the human aspect, the cross and the resurrection are a victory in time, in history. In the divine sense, this a victory outside, assured from the foundation of the world. So we do not need pessimism. The modern world has become rather like the man in Pilgrim's Progress. He is continuously raking up muck with a rake. The muck consists of particles of clay, sand, etc. These are indeed wonderful, but this book has been shown being derived from the magic cosmic dust. It contains the bacteria, wonderful living organisms, fascinating for molecular biologists. But our world has become preoccupied with the fruits of all their work and on the matter and biology of our world, with our mechanical devices, our electronics, our computers, so on, and they are worthy in themselves. Like the man with the muck rake, our eyes are so turned earthward we cannot see the spiritual dimension. The golden crown held above our heads, the crown of God's love, that can be made visible by the golden key of faith, which I think that's what you were pointing to there, Dwayne.
Well, actually, can I just tell a quick story here?
Ken,
Because again, it's the unseen. There's a situation there where these church ministers were being martyred up in Siberia here. This is in the last century. The story got out where there's 8 or 9 of these ministers that are being lined up, and they're asked to recant and get life or die. And first one went, second one went, third one went, and there was a guard there that was seeing this angel, and as they were being martyred, the crown was placed on their head. And it got to the point where the last person was there, and he recanted, and that guard said, "I'll go." And so he saw that angel put the crown, and then this guy's recanted because no one's there to witness, thinking, well, it doesn't matter. I can hold on to my life. My comrades won't know. But that guard said, "I'll die for Christ." He saw, and that's that there's much more going on than what you realize, and it's not what you do. It's simply if you believe.
Yeah.
It opens the door. Without faith, you can't do anything, and that's the fundamental problem. Is that people don't recognize that tacit dimension where it's faith seeking understanding. You have to believe in order to know. It's not the other way around, and until you get that right way around, you're never going to understand.
Yeah. No, I think the whole book is saying it's amazing what there is here to be observed, but there is this whole level you're talking about, the spiritual dimension, the unseen, that is even more amazing than that. Right?
Yeah, because we lost that word wonder and awe. Like Jim used to talk about, he talks about that, that childlikeness where you have wonder and awe. And that's where the scientists, where they have this wonder and they're so committed to play in the sandbox of life, and they figure this stuff out and they just marvel at what God's made. We've lost that wonder and awe because everything we are too amazed with the works of our own hands, and that type of idolatry has really created a quagmire for us that we can't seem to get out of.
Yeah. Well, the good news of what it is that T.F. Torrance is doing, that we're getting, is he's raising our eyes as the church to see that these are conversations that are worth engaging, and that we get to be witnesses to the goodness of all that, there is a meaningfulness that comes to life when you really understand the dimensions that it is that we're talking about here. So, yeah. Well, good. Well, we have a couple weeks here. Next week, I will be in San Antonio. I'll be at the American Academy of Religion. I'm trying to figure out whether or not it would work on I think the T.F. Torrance session is on Friday. It may be possible to stream that using
Didn't it get moved to Saturday? Because I thought this year is a Bart. It's a discussion of Paul Molnar's Time book. I think it is. I thought it was the lecture was going to be on Saturday. Yeah, because it's different than it normally was on Friday.
You may be right. Let's see here. Agenda, schedule. Looking at.
Yeah, I wanted to go this year, but I decided that I'm not gonna. I'm kind of sad, but man, I haven't been there since San Diego, so I'm hoping I'm gonna plan to go for next year in San Diego if everything works out and California's still there. There's no guarantee in that, man. Whatever is possible can be possible, and that's what people don't understand about the contingent order. If there is an earthquake, there is an earthquake.
You get earthquakes where you are?
No, that's we're lucky that way. We feel a little bit of effects, but nothing too major. We've got enough stuff to absorb because we're not so close to the Rockies now. It's a lot flatter, and so it's not quite as bad.
So one of the questions is if I can do a broadcasting of what's going on there, is that something that you guys would like to see?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, because I know usually GCI does the recording of the lecture or whatever like that, and they put it up after. But it'd be
Yeah.
nice to know, because Paul Molnar's book, they're on freedom of God. That's, I think, I think that's an amazing subject for people to discuss.
They have it listed here on the AAR app, and it's Friday from 1 to
Oh, it is
4.
Friday. Okay, it's my mistake then.
So it says our meeting this year will be held jointly with the Karl Barth Society. It will feature panel discussion with Paul Molnar's recent book, Freedom, Necessity, and the Knowledge of God, in conversation with Karl Barth and T.F. Torrance. So anyway, I will I'll see it, because I know that it does come out later, but sometimes it's nice to just be able to um stream being present. So I'll see what I can do with that. There's
Well, thanks,
Bill.
Marty.
The week after is gonna be Thanksgiving, so we won't meet on Thanksgiving. The week after that, we have Al Kimmel, who it's taken me forever to get him to show up for something. I think he thinks he's a little bit of a TF heretic or something. But I said, well, come and let's talk about it.
What's the subject, Marty?
Let me tell you what the subject is. The subject is, we'll be looking at the article Universalism or Election in the Scottish Journal of Theology, written by T.F. Torrance. And Al wants to talk about Torrance's view. I think he disagrees with Torrance's view. And I said, well, come on and let's talk about it. So we'll get that article for that week posted, and then we'll talk with him to see different ways of looking at T.F. Torrance and universalism.
But isn't that a common charge though? Like, a lot of people don't understand his. It's just that grace is grace is grace, grace, but there is a finality of things where it's either a yes or a no.
I think Al wants to say that Torrance is a universalist, and Torrance doesn't want to say that. So anyway, it'll be an interesting
Oh yeah.
conversation.
Yeah,
So yeah,
the nuances.
good. Well, we have one more book left in this series, which we'll do in, I think it's the following week, and that's Russell Standard, Grounds for Reasonable Belief, will be the final number 12 of the 12 books. So then we will
You've
complete
gotten
it.
smarter, Marty, from doing this.
Well, you know what? It actually has made a
Challenge
difference. There is a gathering of knowledge, and there are conversations that I'm having where elements from this are showing up. T.F. Torrance also had another series of 5 that I discovered. So I'm gathering those books, and in 2024 we'll look at those 5 books. The first one he wrote, and that was Christian Theology and Scientific Culture. I also have in that series Ian Paul's Science, Theology, and Einstein.
Oh wow.
So the other 3 books I've ordered, and they're on the way, but I don't have them yet. So I think it's in January we'll start with the Torrance book in that series, and just do what we've been doing with this series. I'm just trying to get people to see Torrance's investment in a community conversation between theology and science, and that he brought voices together, and they easily get missed. Sometimes the Torrance one gets read and then the others don't. But I do think that, as you say, Dwayne, there is a learning, even Torrance better, by reading these other people. And sometimes they may have learned something from Torrance, but maybe Torrance learned from them also.
Well, the thing that strikes me is so strange is that, like, I wish John would have finished his last book, because him and Tom were in on this, the Word made flesh,
Yeah.
that
Well, maybe
logos.
you finish that book for him.
I looked at some of the stuff, but because I could think he was a student of John Wheeler, and John
Yeah.
Wheeler's 2 students are Kip Thorne and Stephen Hawking. When John used to talk about that stuff, I was just so marveled at it, because and that's why Tom loved him so much, and because when he met Tom at Fuller, that's where all this background began to make sense, because he got lost up, after he went to Princeton and got taught by John Wheeler. Like, he was really had a great mathematical and scientific mind, but he got caught up in that hippie Sartre nothingness and meaningless existential stuff there. He was out there in Haight Ashbury having sex like it was free.
I miss those days. So that was
Well, that was one of the funniest things, because the thing because every different churches have this idea where the ministers get caught up in some kind of sexual morality, but one of John's infamous quotes, tongue in cheek, there is like, "I had more sex with women than you could ever imagine." So he survived.
thanks be
He
God for
calls
his
it the abyss.
grace.
He called it the abyss, because it leads to more existential confusion, more existential loneliness, and
Yeah.
that's why he was so grateful to meet his wife and the turnaround he made, and he was able to make sense of his life after the education he had at Princeton, and then went on to be a theologian.
God is a God of redemption. He takes people from all kinds of places to bring them into service for the good of the kingdom. Well, good. Well, thank you for showing up all today, and I hope that this was stimulating, and maybe that there is more that you'd want to explore in those books, knowing that they exist. But I will post whatever I can find so you know whether something will happen on Friday next week. That's when the Torrance session is. It won't be on Thursday. I know that for sure. But I will see what the possibilities are for Friday. And it'll be 1 o'clock, whatever time it is in
They're central.
San Antonio. So that's Central is 1 hour different from Pacific? Or is
2
2 hours?
1 hour behind Eastern Standard and 2 ahead of Pacific.
Right.
One ahead
So
of
that would be 3 o'clock.
It'd be 11 o'clock,
Pacific time.
11 o'clock Pacific, and 2 o'clock Eastern.
It's 2 hours earlier. It's 2 hours earlier than it is here. That's what it'll be. So anyway, I will attempt to make it understandable, whatever I come up with. And
Man,
we'll
have
go from
fun.
there. Okay. So blessings on you all, and have a great one.
Thanks.
And if I don't see
Thanks,
you next
Todd.
week, I'll see you in
Marty.
after Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving
thanks,
to you
Bill.
all.
Yeah, you guys.
Happy
Thanks a lot.
Thanksgiving.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.